Hello everyone, today we read and comment on the 31st paragraph of the second chapter of the second book of von Clausewitz, Vom Kriege. The title being Locality, or Terrain if you prefer actually. The text follows. The locality, which we prefer leaving for solution under the head of country and ground, might, strictly speaking, be without any influence at all if the combat took place on a completely level and uncultivated plain. In a country of steppes, such as a case may occur, but in the cultivated countries of Europe it is almost an imaginary idea. Therefore, a combat between civilized nations, in which country and ground have no influence, is hardly conceivable. So in this paragraph, von Clausewitz introduces the first circumstance, let's say, which always attend the application of the means in the art of war, which is terrain, right, or locality, or country and ground, whatever you want to call it. And the paragraph is very interesting because it's somewhat it shows from one side the relation between theory and reality, in the sense that of course there can't be a really direct relation in this sense, as reality always varies from theory, but still there can be something that comes close to it at one point you can approximately consider, and that also shows kind of the concreteness and pragmatic character of von Clausewitz Vom Kriege. From the other side, there are also certain hints and informations, let's say, that make us understand better how von Clausewitz frames this concept, because the topic that is touched here is actually clamorously close to many things, sometimes even the only ones that you hear recurrently when people discuss these topics, like what if these two armies fought on a flatland, so reducing the asymmetry to zero in theory and therefore testing what they should really be like. And in fact, you don't have to misunderstand the paragraph itself. Here we're still in the field of theory, and von Clausewitz is actually making us understand that, of course, that condition of asymmetry does not exist. That condition of symmetry does not exist in reality, as the situation is always asymmetrical, and even in those conditions in which it's apparently or approximately in that way, still this is like you have to consider the terrain as such as a factor among the others, right? So this is how the paragraph is conceived. It's not conceived to tell you like that locality and country are the single most important thing. It is definitely one of the elements that remains constantly on the foreground, but you interact with it in a way that is always different, not just because the ground is always different, but because also the means that you have, the push that you have, the spiritual material forces that you have are different. And this is just about the terrain, right? In the other paragraphs we will see the time of the day and weather, etc. Now, on the importance of terrain, I think there is not much to explain, right? As it's self-evident. Right? In the previous paragraph, we have explained, I made an example about a case of a battle that I studied, and how ground obviously influences the whole thing, and how the most important thing here the author is stressing is that never comes to an end. Right, and that especially the situation always varies, and it can't be brought down, if not by approximation, in very certain particular scenarios. Right, always considering that here there is a concrete take even on other issues. Like, for example, you could say, well, terrain varies not just because physically speaking, like isolated from the rest. There is an atmosphere as well. There is a time of day, there is a weather, that there are conditions that change in temperature, and I don't know, if it rains, ground gets softer, and it can, or in certain situations, it can change, yes, but this is why von Clausewitz is separating them, and just to make you understand how they individually interfere, not because they do not have an interaction, of course, right? So always keep this in mind, and do not misunderstand von Clausewitz as an abstract talker, because in this, what he states in here, the appreciation and the judgments he makes are actually very, very pragmatic, very materially oriented, let's say concretely oriented, more than materially, actually. And the okay, so locality, terrain. The locality which we prefer leaving for solution under the head of countering ground might, strictly speaking, be without any influence at all if the combat took place on a completely level and uncultivated plain. And okay, let's conclude it. In a country of steppes, such a case may occur, but in the uncultivated countries of Europe, it is almost an imaginary idea. So stopping a little while before the last phrase, what does this mean overall? And of course, there are places in the world, like the steppes, but not only, evidently, that present flatlands, that in practice, in terms of what should be considered, pragmatically speaking, about the theory of the art of war, meaning what you have to do practically to lead an army, to make it fight, are theoretically influent. Now, theoretically, this is all theoretical, which means that basically you don't have to take into account the fact that it's all the other factors that can be inherent to the same ground. At one point, von Clausewitz, for example, talks about rain and says, if it rains, it's not actually a big deal most of the times, right? The rain doesn't quite change much in the way armies fight, right? And this is very important because you would say that rain is actually an important factor, right? That it can change a lot. Well, theoretically it can, considering the weather, considering the general visibility and other attrition due to, maybe it gets colder, maybe it depends on the situation. Actually, it depends on other factors that are not the rain in itself. But as you understand here, von Clausewitz says, actually in that specific case, that doesn't quite matter much. Like if it starts raining, you don't feel. It's as if in the practicality of how you wage war, it didn't count anything. And this is very important because to me it seems pretty banal now to say, but when I first read it, I said, well, but I thought that rain was kind of more important than that. And then I realized that objectively it's not. And the measure, and this is what actually the finesse of von Clausewitz stands here because he's not actually measuring that for you. He's not presenting you with like data about how objectively rain is quite an influent factor in how you wage war. But you can kind of get it by itself if you start, in fact, studying campaigns and wars, and you realize how, of course, rain can change things. Like, there are people who claim things like, the Mongols didn't have it easy. They stopped in Europe because in the Hungarian plain, because that year was particularly humid, it rained. Aside from the fact that the Mongols went to fight like in Southeast Asia, it is not exactly very dry weather, and they invaded Russia in winter, which is not also quite a dry place either, right? The question you may point at that point, if there was rain in Hungary, what the heck did that change in the whole account? Like, von Clausewitz is actually a fan, so I can't speak in these terms of von Clausewitz. Von Clausewitz actually tells you something that was pointed out even by, I've read sometimes some medieval poems that actually talked about this. That is the idea that even if, a nail breaks, for example, in a chariot, you can get to military disaster, right? It is pretty strange, but that's in the theory of games, in a way, also what attrition can fundamentally look like. Von Clausewitz addresses the attrition as, in fact, something that starts from several factors altogether, but which you can't say, which was objectively the cause, because of course there were multiple, but also you can't quite say where it started from and what you could do about it. Actually, you can't do anything about it, but it seems that if you take into account a factor like rain, well, probably not much is gonna change after all. And maybe what changes the deal in there is not even rain as such, but maybe the rest of the weather. Like it depends where, for example, it rains, with consistency, and which is the rest of the climate, how it interferes, for example, with the same ground, and of course with which side. There are different the change that this can bring for the different armies is different at that point. Of course, always kind of favoring or disfavoring the respective sides. I mean, to one of the two sides, reciprocally. So or respectively, actually. The example of rain is actually important because if you compare it to the ground, it actually becomes something very very meaningless, right? If you have to climb a mountain, well, the whole deal, it's the mountain. Then when it rains or not, it's not necessarily going to make a big difference after all. Maybe with certain particular types of grounds, in fact, I mean, in terms even of the composition of it, or how they maybe, I don't know, but the energy that you have to invest to climb the mountain is still enormous compared to the one you have to employ to cope with wet ground, right? So that is important because we tend to reason like, I don't know, the ground is there, and we kind of just, it's not a big deal. We have to concentrate on how slippery that rock is because it's rain or didn't, right? And losing track of the fact that the single most important thing there is not the rain, but where it rains, right? This is just an example for making you understand how instead the ground has an enormous impact overall that can be approximated to zero only when you in fact fight, just considering it as a single variable in its physical structure, when it's a flatland, right? The point von Clausewitz is making here is, are there flatlands everywhere? Obviously not. There are places, certain landscapes, certain countries that are characterized by flatlands. But even in there, quite easily, there could be something like, I don't know, a river. There can't be a ditch, right? Why not? Terrain can be, built in there. So these are naturally factors that are not inherent to the ground in itself. So what von Clausewitz is really saying is that, yes, there are theoretically certain grounds that are so leveled that you can say, okay, it's smooth sailing on them, smooth walking, let's say, there at this point on terrain. But the question is, what are you going to do with it, right? How often is this going to present itself? And he says in Europe, for example, this most likely doesn't happen. And it's interesting that in here, von Clausewitz in fact inserts among the factors, for example, that there can be things like cultivations, right? Here it says, you can have a flatland in a completely level and uncultivated plain. So von Clausewitz is adding to, in my opinion, very refinedly, an element that, although kind of extraneous to the terrain meant as strictly physically, like orographically speaking, is a part, in fact, not just of the terrain, but of a country proper, of a land that is characterized by a landscape of a certain type. So an uncultivated plain is naturally also devoid of other structures, etc. But where are you going to find this realistically? And if you, most of the times this doesn't happen, you have to cope with the fact that there are farms, there are fences, there are ditches, there are other structures that are going to change that ground, right? And it's and the way you interact with it. So at the point that in certain lands like Europe, he says the idea of having a perfect flatland where to find is an imaginary idea, right? And in a combat between civilized nations, which here he means like, in the West they were objectively fighting, they were kind of more advanced in other places, like the steppe, right? But in let's say, it's hardly conceivable to think of a country, the terrain of which is, devoid of any other obstacle. The question at this point is also a bit different. Like, okay, this is obvious. Like, we have revolved around this concept that is very simple. It's difficult to find a flatland where there is nothing, and therefore you don't have to care about terrain, right? And I would go more far than that. Like, for example, if this flatland brought to a particular advantage and reciprocal and let's say complementary disadvantage from the other side, in terms of between two armies, I mean, why would, for example, the army that is disadvantaged fight on that ground? Like, would make them do? Like, who would venture there? Because that's the point. You would keep following, I don't know, certain reliefs, for example, and the battle would come to be fought. Most likely, if the guy was disadvantaged by a flatland in conditions of controlling where the fight is gonna take place, well, it's gonna divert the whole campaign, right? So, given that in a realistic strategic theater, it's impossible to find a flatland in this sense. Also because the places in the world where you would find these flatlands would be, not very, not really places where lots of armies have fought, other than, I mean, especially among, in fact, as von Clausewitz says, among kind of civilized nations. It's obvious that in the steppes there was enough room for like lots of people to find in flatlands, and having a the same warfare actually developing on the base of that factors, one of the factors. But in the rest of the world, and meaning in every single region where at the end of the day you can't get to a place where that is not a flatland because maybe there is a river in it, or just because there is a small hilltop, well, the whole thing starts changing. So talking about a perfect flatland, saying, okay, we can conceive this realistically, at the point it doesn't have any effect, is basically, in fact, unrealistic, on the contrary. So this has a particular importance in the moment you assess the how you can think of terrain, even not just of a battlefield, but of an entire country, right, of a front line, and how it's gonna influence anyway. At the point you can't take it out of the equation, and it's a very heavy one, especially that is really gonna change a lot in a way the war it will be fought. I'm stressing this aspect because theoretically I could stop it here, like saying it's that simple. Like von Clausewitz, for example, ends with therefore a combat between civilized nations in which country and ground have no influence is hardly conceivable, right? And that's it, you take it. But what I would like to make you understand more deeply, and maybe at one point I should make a video about it, is realizing a little bit better, let's say, how this is real at the point that we should get rid even of the question whether, imagine two armies fighting on a flat land. Why? Because we have this, in fact, principle that is very abstract, that is essentially the same one from Clausewitz is criticizing, that is saying, okay, let's eliminate from the equation all those factors that, such as, for example, terrain, at the point of saying, okay, let's fight in a flatland, so nobody's advantaged by gravity, by the other physical impediments on the ground, etc. The question is, why would you want to do it? Because that's where it all goes. Like, von Clausewitz here is criticizing essentially those military theorists are saying, okay, let's eliminate factors to get what war should be in abstract at that point. The point is that there is never an end to that. Like saying, if you start taking away piece by piece, like factor from by factor from the equation, how real that war would be. How about what kind of war would that be properly, right? And taking away the ground, like saying, imagine two armies fighting in a flatland, is like, find me a single battle, historically speaking, that was fought in a real flatland. Because at that point you could say, oh, well, yes, look at this plain is kind of flat. Yeah, okay, but you have to think there were farms, there were huts, there were rivers, there were marshes, there were parts of the terrain that were kind of harder or softer than others. There were other elements you can't take out of the equation in there that will make you say, okay, yes, this is kind of a flatland, but it's not that the terrain at that point is equal for all the armies involved. And secondly, fighting on a flatland is kind of mostly evident, something that would uneven certain differences. Like, if you have the possibility of choosing, why would you fight on a flatland, right? You wouldn't always try to fight in a place that, of course, would give you a certain type of favor, right? The problem is that, of course, if you are disadvantaged, why would you want to fight in a flatland? First of all, you should be obliged to do it, right? And you would basically decide to take away an element of possible advantage, where you like fighting on a steep ground, for example. Like, let's imagine just the most simple thing. You are in numerical inferiority. In fighting in a flatland against an enemy, let's assume that everything was homogeneous at that point, which is the ridiculous thing in here. Just let's presume you could choose a place where to fight. At that point, if you are in numerical inferiority, assuming that everything was the same, like everybody is so, but you wouldn't fight on a flatland. You would like to fight somewhere else, right? Because at that point you would try to compensate your disadvantage in some other way. Of course, there are many other things that intervene, so that you could even decide to fight on a flatland if, for example, you were in numerical inferiority, but you still thought to be qualitatively superior, that you could carry out a certain particular tactics that most of the time is actually tied to the terrain, right? Even having a forest, a bush where you can hide your troops is like saying that is the terrain, and therefore it's not flat. Here we're not talking about necessarily the surface of it, but what also exists on the surface, and the point you can't hamper your movements, right? So asking like, what if everything was the same, could simply lead just to like, it would be 50-50. Or maybe a draw, because if in absolute terms, because there would be no any other difference. So what's the point of idealizing or making a theory, right? With a alleged practical aim, by saying, imagine two armies fighting on a flatland. mean, I can't think of a practical reason why one would like to do that, right? And once you have seen that you're disadvantaged, you wouldn't even fight in there anymore. It's like saying, imagine two soldiers fighting for two moments in history for some reason. Let's imagine that their abilities were the same. And first of all, if there are two different soldiers, like in terms of, especially their different times and ages, like it's obvious that they are kind of what is an equal ability, that they can use theoretically each other's weapon in the same way exactly. What's the deal? And secondly, that they're identical human beings in terms of force, of strength, of motivation, and whatever. And what would it be real for? Like, what would you derive from it, right? Because at the point in which those soldiers will fight, surprise, surprise, the guy who is in the disadvantage wouldn't fight in that way, because they're not stupid, right? And this is what peoples do, historically speaking. They get acquainted with a military system that doesn't, that crushes them. They start fighting in a different way. So the concept of presenting like two different, like presenting an asymmetry and saying, just take away all the possible elements that can make that thing, that can highlight that asymmetry at the end of the day, because that's also what you're interested in at that point. It's like saying, we know that two armies are gonna win, like one is winning against the other, because most of these questions are aimed at that, like at finding out which is the army that is the strongest, that would crush the others. Like, it's full of people who are literally obsessed, from my generation, from even younger generations, that they're literally obsessed, like, at quoting improbable things like armies of hundreds of thousands fighting on a battlefield, or inventing numbers, considering this merely material dimension of history just for treating it as like a football game, right? Who scored more goals, right? And what's the what do you have to do with that, right? If there is something that history teaches us constantly, is that you can easily win someone in certain conditions that is superior to you in certain particular different contexts, just by exploiting asymmetry, which is also an asymmetry of ground, for example. Like, what do you think the Germans attracted the Romans in the Teutoburg forest for? Because they wanted to have a camping together before the battle, or do you think there is a reason maybe for that? So at that point, historically speaking, what the hell cares how would the Romans and the Germans fight in open field, with a considerable advantage of the Romans, of course, for someone who has to free his own country from a foreign occupation, like Arminius was doing. Like, that's the real deal. We do not care about armies or soldiers that fight on equal ground. We don't give a damn about it. It's not funny. It's not intelligence. It's useless. It's just deteriorating reality in the beauty of its complexity, just for the sake of saying that in a certain particular condition that doesn't fit with the historical environment, how that would look for what, right? And especially with which moral strength, like who would oblige those people to fight in that way, if at that point the disadvantage or the advantage would be so clearly observable, and that there would be a side that would eventually not want to fight, who would like to fight less, and another that would like to fight more. And guess what? The first one would try not to fight, and therefore the whole thing is altered. And part of the reason why there is this mistake is in fact that people reason like in terms of linear, like internal lines. It's mostly a theoretical thinking that everything is kind of material, geometrical, and not like the Clausewitzian concept that war is primarily a clash between moral forces, so that you have to have a good reason to go out there and fight and kill someone or getting killed. So I promise I will make a video about this, like a serious one, like very well structured and clear, in its meaning, but already from this paragraph you can get essentially how deep the mistake of who pretends to take out equations, right? And that's a problem with war games, for example. War games are meant to simulate the complexity of reality, and instead they fixate on a reduction, like a simplification of reality. You would say, well, we can't reproduce reality, not even if we wished, like if we wanted. Yes, we can't, but theoretically a war game worth this name would at least try to attempt to be an ever more complicated thing that would try to simulate like the enormous complexities of reality, not just like narrowing them down to a few parameters that you can say, I don't know, how is that guy equipped, and following it, because that's not a fight, essentially. That's not combat, it's just a abstract extrapolation of something that will never happen in reality, and which you already know that will not happen. And they would answer you something like, yeah, okay, but that factor is still considered. Yes, okay, that factor is considered, but what is usefulness if it's detached from the others? Like, where is a realistic context where that would be the case? Because there is not, and it's that simple. And that's also a reason why, by the way, it's beautiful to study history in this sense, because history is not made by simplifying things, or better, historians tend to do that for the sake, of course, of explanation and comprehension, but history presents you with the continuous complication of interpretations. Like, it's the other way around. Like, you always have to eventually narrow the thing down to the few things to make yourself understood, which is an enormously difficult thing. But at the same time, you realize and you know that there is like an enormous niche for improvement that can even come to even to fundamentally make you change idea on a certain topic by far, and therefore every one of these statements, like considering the flat land as, for example, as a condition of equal ground, is not impossible in reality, but it still by itself doesn't make it real, right? It can be a factor, also a very important one, but it's never undetached from the rest, right? And still, if we really were to reason in absolute terms, there is nothing like a flatland. Nothing like a country where you enter, it's just a flat surface with nothing. The thing would, it does develop like an extremely irregular thing, picture you have to move in, and that's where all the fun starts. So I personally understand the perplexities of those who like to say, like, okay, but what if we want to get a more direct, like a simplification of this picture, right? After all, isn't von Clausewitz talking about certain things that happen, like, because we have said it in the previous paragraphs, like that can constitute the base for the theory of the art of war, that in this sense are kind of a bit narrowing down these conditions and eliminating certain factors. Yes, but it's slightly different, because in that case von Clausewitz is not telling you that through that theory you can win by default. It's not even telling you that you should follow that theory on the field. Von Clausewitz is telling you that you should keep that theory in mind, and at the same time using your talent and genius to deal with what you see in reality. And the reason being that that theory has been built throughout the observation of certain military events that have in fact have occurred in reality, and that we have tried to reconstruct historically speaking, but that are those specific encounters. Like they're not like what can happen in absolute terms all the time. So it's very, very, very different from saying, okay, now we have to try to eliminate everything and just leveling all the factors and considering just the ones that we care about. And you would also at that point have to tell me with which criterion you would do that, because at this point, as I was saying before, we could level everything at the point you want to draw. So actually what you're trying to do at that point is trying to sort out other factors that, however, at that point, as we have explained, wouldn't have any meaning, because if you take away all the other ones, they would lose meaning. They would transform into something else, right? Unless you don't want two robots fighting, which is evidently not a real fight, right? And then not even in that case it would be actually feasible, because still the robot, for example, would fight on this terrain, which is something it's not intrinsically programmed for. Or even if it were, it wouldn't be perfectly made for it. So what is interesting about von Clausewitz is that he gets perfectly the the curiosity of those who reason in these terms. Like, he knows that tendentially we all think things like, now we want the big clash in a flatland between two armies to see which is the toughest one. He also understands using a theory on the base of experience to make a synthesis of what we have seen and to be aware of it, to be wary of it, but not of thinking that reality always functions in that way. Because the greatest challenge that we have is not, in fact, isolating, like taking away factors, variables, it's adding them. Like, the value of a historical inquiry augments the more factors you take into consideration, and you're able to make a synthesis out of them, right? It's there that the not just the scientific, the scientific side of the story is valid, but also the one of the mind, the talent, the genius, the understanding of who makes that synthesis, that analysis, before and synthesis after, is functioning. Like, whether you have to do with someone who understands what is reading or not. And what von Clausewitz is trying to make us understand in reality is how our brain is already predisposed actually to frame a lot of data altogether without actually calculating them scientifically, but already getting an impression that is actually pretty accurate, right? So our curiosity of taking away factors for the sake of seeing what happens is actually something different. It has to do rather with with reasons that are irrational, as a matter of fact, because irrationality tells us instead that if we really want to understand something so complicated, we should at least get ourselves acquainted with it and not pretending to know it through just a synthesis, like a theory. And believe me, this is a big topic, because that's probably the single most difficult aspect that, in spite of everything, like even in historical awareness, is to be understood when you study these topics, right? Because no matter what, people will listen to you talking about history, but they will not get to the point of understanding this one. And that's where all the mistakes derive from, all the actual errors are made, right? And it's somehow still a struggle between those who want to make a synthesis and those who want to make an analysis. And most of the times they're the same people kind of go back and forth, because history is also made for the sake of social utility. At one point you have to finish an inquiry. You can't continue studying like forever. If anything, because you're mortal, if you're lucky, you can arrive up to 120, then you're done for, and and therefore you also have to put the word end to your activity, and this is probably the single most important reason for which we want to let's say to pretend that reality is simpler than it is, because we want to have the presumption of going on and understanding everything, as if our life wasn't such a big mystery after all, that everything fits into what we're kind of educated and framed to think within. This is really a deep concept, telling the truth, because it explains to you why also we need to come out here and talk about certain things, like and why we need to make to write that word end, to draw that point at some point. And that's also why it's so difficult. For example, that's why it makes such long videos, because theoretically I could simply say, okay, now I read this paragraph from Clausewitz, I will leave it to people and simply presume that they will understand it by themselves. It doesn't work. It hasn't worked. Not for me specifically. I'm not, as you know, I'm not really particularly interested in convincing other people. But what I do here is also something that I use for myself, because the more I explore these thoughts and the more I realize how, in spite of the difficulty, there is a path you can follow. And that is, I think, the accurate one. And it always changes, telling the truth. The impression always changes, but it's still the direction that really matters at the end of the day. So it's actually, in my opinion, more beautiful to get yourself lost into these sea of let's say unknown waters that you don't know where they will take you to, than pretending that you've put the word hand to that store. Because at that point it's like the death of, if you're really scared of death, that's what you shouldn't do, because that's as if you died within. You said, I don't want to hear any more about this story, I don't want to open up myself again. You've ended leaving, because all we have in here is our consciousness about this world and what we can think of it, we can figure out of it. And if we stop, we stop doing what really makes us human, and it's intolerable, and that's what von Clausewitz is explaining to you in here. You can make a synthesis of all what you want and pretending that it's over, but it's never over. You will never make a proficient use of that synthesis unless you keep on trying and trying and trying and failing, because you wouldn't try otherwise. But it's still better than doing nothing, because what you learn through that failure is actually what brings you forward to a better understanding, and a real better one. Not having an opinion and thinking that that's the good one, then you can't put your tiny flag on it and saying, oh, look at here, I'm right, I'm great, I'm good, and then doing nothing about it, because at that point you're actually harming people, because even in potential, if you stop there, basically you decided that someone else will do it, someone else will take the matter in his own hands, someone else will think it further. And what you could do, it's finished there. Of course we can't understand the whole world, but we can't stop learning, we can't stop trying. And that's the ultimate goal. And that's also where we're polarized towards it, why we need so many books, we want to know so much more extra stuff. And I presume also the way of saying, not accepting criticism is a way to say, okay, well, I'm just as good as I can be. Like, I don't owe explanation to anyone. You have just to take what I say, otherwise, and I will not accept any different opinion. That's not fair either, because towards yourself. Because, for example, if I think of videos I made 2 years ago, I also forgot Schwerpunkt's birthday. It was kind of 3 days ago, I think. Um, I I would I would change objectively a lot, not just because my English was even worse than now, nor because I was so less aware of certain things, but simply because I realized that I have gotten something that I can't properly explain to you. Like, I can't tell you this awareness where it comes from. I don't have a manual, and this is what von Clausewitz here wants us to make us realize, that you can't even have your manual you can read and understand things from, but until you don't do the thing by yourself, you will never be as good as you can be. So that's how I see it, and that's why even considering things like considering I don't know, two armies fighting on a flatland, because you don't want to accept that maybe certain armies, historically speaking, were designed even to fight on places that were not flatlands, for example, is a deep historical realization. Is actually an important aspect, right? It's not just about criticizing a bunch of kids on the internet because they presume that I don't know, who would win between 19th century British infantry against a Roman legion in a flatland, right? Just to see what happens, right? Of course, the Roman legion gets annihilated, but the point I was telling you in here is what is the necessity for doing it? Like, why would you preoccupy yourself with certain aspects? So you could even say, well, I don't know, because there were people, for example, who believed that, I don't know, I remember once Matt Easton and Lindeberg were asked something like, but this YouTube comments, like, in fact, who would win? I think it was exactly, it was World War the First, let's say 100 World War the First British riflemen and 1,000 Roman legionnaires, right? And the guy was given the answer, and I don't know whether that's not the, we don't know whether he listened or not. We don't care now. But if he did that, he probably realized that that's not even a sensible question for a person who maybe has some deep historical awareness about certain factors. I mean, these are not kind of questions that are even, it's not that they're not realistic as such, but they're not, they tell you so much about the person who asks them, that doesn't know about, I don't know, the fact that a rifle of the First World War has such a huge amount of joules in its projectile while it's shot, that, you know, could, that in the ancient world could it not even be dreamt of. And there is such a huge disproportion that until you, in fact, you don't consider that material aspect of the story, it doesn't, you know, the person probably doesn't realize that, or is not aware of that. But the problem is, in fact, not this. That the answer should have been, which I think was given by the two YouTubers, like, this is not real. Like, why would the Roman fight at that point? And the first time they realize what a rifle can do, they wouldn't show around. They would change their tactics. They would change their equipment. Everything would change. Hence, that's why it's not real. Because it doesn't make any damn sense. And while it can help you to understand certain aspects of warfare, it's still as if, you know, you stopped to a point where you're wasting your time with such questions. You should just take a lot of books and started reading from them. Because if you're really interested in knowing things more, you can't go bit by bit. Like, you should be able to build up a structure and to make it function, right? So this is the realization at the end. It's not much of a very complicated thought after all. And the idea also, I would suggest for anyone who is interested in this stuff, is try effectively to study a campaign. and see how many troubles you have. First of all, to solve that tactical problem, in the way just in the way it happened, not even in its potential, right? And come and tell us after you have studied 5 or 10 whether you can think still that, I don't know, for example, a weapon is what makes the difference. And this chapter, this paragraph on terrain, actually is very meaningful because of what we said at the very beginning. It's a problem of realizing this is one of the factors. It's not all of them, but that it's always there and that it's imposant. Because terrain is in fact what we instinctively try to dismiss in these situations. Like saying, oh, let's pretend for a moment that, I don't know, that the terrain wasn't a problem in here. That it was actually something else that we don't have to take into account. Well, it can't be so. And this is what mostly von Clausewitz is interested in. Realizing that terrain, whether you like it or not, is always going to remain there and to make a massive change in the way combat takes place. And how you can't do without in any situation. So it's even in flatlands, even in the steppes, like in what you can consider like not a big deal as a factor at that point, but that exactly because it's kind of an exception, and that most of not even that territory will actually be 100% what you can think as a flatland, because a flatland doesn't exist in physical reality. I don't know how this video sounded because I'm getting kind of I don't think I sound like an extremist or something, but I think I'm kind of getting more critical rather than analytical. I don't know how to say this. Like I think you deserve facts more than I'm giving you by every video, and yet it's here that the thing complicates itself, because what are facts anyway? How can you frame a topic like this without using things such as even psychology, or trying to kind of using not shock psychology, because I don't think I say anything particularly shocking at all, but rather using certain rhetorical means that maybe are kind of more punching and have more effects, and are kind of still more trivial, because in part it's as if they after all took into consideration partly the same perspectives of who was making that same mistake, right? So it's before asking these questions and even answering them, we should ask ourselves, because we make this mistake all the time, is the question well put, and why? And why is this question put in the first place? Why do we need to respond to it? Why do we are we rendering a good service in answering to this, or is it really something different, and we should be more consistent instead with the basis of this topic, the theory of this topic, which is what we are discussing in this very moment. So, in my opinion, it's important as a general statement and understanding, and I don't think that we will ever get enough of it, because this is one of those few topics that I think there is never an actual process about, like progress, excuse me. Like, people tend to make this mistake all the time, and the reason is because they're surely in good faith, right? We all started from it, and everybody knows it. You think that I've never posed those questions? well, maybe I don't, not specifically such type of questions, but still making this mistake. I remember actually in very recent times, sometimes, to the problem has a multifaceted, like it's never either you're right or you're wrong. Like you always make the same mistake, because at the end of the day it's a cognitive problem. Like we can't reason also without these concepts at one point. It's really their own the way we have our mind built, right? But I don't. I want to be positive in general, even if this problem has deep also political consequences at the same time. You would say, what the hell are you talking about? You're switched from, kids and just write this stuff on, I don't know, somewhere, from political problems. Yes, because actually there are certain positions that are essentially about this. Basically everything that ends in ism is about this. It's focusing stubbornly on just one variable and pretending it's all what it counts, right? And that's by default a mistake, and that it's against the good human reason, right? And good human reason is powerful, but also needs to be cultivated, and it also needs to be understood, which is actually also the other greater problem, because you can repeat this stuff over and over again, but what if the other person doesn't understand? Like, it's worthless apparently. But this is another topic. I'm not going to discuss this now. Alright, so for today, I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.